then I think that like it's processing correctly.
Right. Okay, well, the little red button says that we are live. So, this is the GEO monthly live stream for March 2024. I am Josh Davis, content manager for Grassroots Economic Organizing. And this is...
I'm Chris.
This is Chris.
I'm Chris, helping out with different things in GEO.
Yeah, yes, our newest member of the official member of the GEO Collective. Very happy to have him on board. Gonna give us a big presence in Chicago now. We're gonna be the big thing in Chicago because of Chris, I think. Yeah, so we don't necessarily have anything really planned so much to talk about this this live stream, but we do have a lot of interesting stuff that went up on the GEO website recently. And Chris, before we started the stream, you were talking about one of them, this series of 3 articles that was originally published on Venezuela Analysis website about a worker co-op, recovered worker co-op named Endorca. And Chris, you wanted to talk about them a little bit, so I want to share your thoughts. Hey, MJ, I recognize that that profile pic from Mastodon, I believe. Anyway, yeah. Chris, go for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just been kind of, I've been thinking more about Venezuela, and actually, I had that saved in my email, that newsletter, because I've been meaning to read it a little bit more. And I got sucked into like the sanctions aspect. And so there's U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, and I guess one of the reasons why I'm also interested in this stuff is because in Chicago, we got at least like 27,000 Venezuelans come in last year. And, it's around the same number of people who have been like socially and ethnically cleansed out of Chicago from 2020 to like 2022. There's actually probably more. I don't think the statistics have been finished.
You mean in terms of like gentrification and?
Yeah, well, the way that the government responds to the pandemic offer like very little support, in my opinion, to poor people.
Yeah.
Like from day one, everybody was just like very vulnerable. There was no like every month what the government do, they put a moratorium on evictions for like the next 30 days. It was always just the next 30 days. It's like people didn't really have any grounding, and he's like, the less privileged that you are, less. So yeah, a lot of people were by design, in my opinion, cleansed out of Chicago, and I believe the majority were Black folks. And so it's interesting that like a similar amount of Venezuelans have been let in to Chicago. Part of me suspects that it's to maintain a certain workforce that can be super oppressed and used to pit against another part of the population. But anyways, I've been kind of wondering like, well, why have a lot of the folks been coming over? And I think the sanctions against Venezuela are playing a large part, because I remember in 2015 hearing about the sanctions from anarchists in Venezuela. And well, one of the articles that GEO put up about the Endorca worker takeover, that's where they mentioned the sanctions, how the sanctions are affecting that worker co-op, and then that's where I kind of started going into looking at the sanctions. And I haven't finished looking into it, but it's interesting because like there's this whole thing about like Citgo, which is related to Venezuela. And actually, in Chicago, very close to where I live, there's a Citgo refining. Well, I don't know what it is. I actually don't know. It's they have the those huge
Like the big
structures
tanks.
that hold the oil, I believe.
Yeah, the big tanks. Yeah.
Big old tanks, and they say Citgo, and I've been wondering what's going on with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're connecting some dots that I think most people probably don't, but I don't think it's that far fetched to connect. Which, on the one hand, yeah, we've seen massive immigration from Venezuela. I've got a buddy in Missoula, Montana, and even there, I've seen a lot of folks coming up from countries south of the border, and he speaks Spanish and is married to a woman from Colombia and plays salsa, and he's hanging out with like the South American contingent all the time, and and there's several Venezuelans who have all moved up here because of the situation they were facing due to the sanctions down there, and we're able to get out. So we're fortunate, I guess, in that regard. But yeah, you can look at the immigration to the U.S. and it never gets asked like what's driving it, right? Like because I learned this from my hanging out with guys in Nepal who wanted to come to the U.S. and work, and a lot of them ended up going to other countries and working. Couple actually made it to the U.S., but nobody wanted to like move. They just wanted to go and make some money and come back, and just for the most part, it seems it's like most people, I think, like don't want to immigrate to a foreign, a country that's foreign to them. Would prefer to stay where they're from, by and large. And so we don't, when we see all these people coming up, we don't ask why. And one of the reasons why, especially in the case of Venezuela, is these sanctions, which horrible U.S. foreign policy that's been universally horrible, regardless of who's in office. Going back, of course, to Hugo Chavez and our great hatred for that man and everything that he stood for. And then, even after he's gone, we still don't like the Maduro government. They're way too socialist for American tastes. So, yeah, we've got sanctions, which are it's economic warfare. That's what sanctions are. It's how you declare war. It's how you carry on war against a country without having to, drop any bombs. But the intent is the same. It's to make the population suffer. That we even say that, directly. That the reason we put sanctions on, one of the reasons, is to try to encourage political change in that country. It's pretty messed up. But the workers at Endorka, despite facing this, and they're working in metallurgy, like making like aluminum goods, and their business got all sorts of messed up because of the blockade. But they've been doing their best to work around it and work with other co-ops and other businesses in the area to figure out other things they can do. So anyway. Chris?
Yeah, I would like to hear what eventually happens because, I mean, that's tough. Like for any country dominated by a foreign power, you're trying to transition away from that dependence on, right? Because that's how a lot of these, even in the many cities in the U.S., they've been structured to where you can't have any real independence within your locality. And so as soon as you break away, you're going to have to deal with how you've had all these interdependencies set up against your will, against your decision. And how do you survive when things get cut off or when you want to wean off of the dependency outside of your local area? And so I'm curious to see like how they might convert production to not be dependent on other countries or even the oil itself. I'm very curious about that, if they want to move away from those types of industries. I remember there was this cool article I read. I think it was from the Left Libertarian Review or the Anarcho Syndicalist Review, where some of the workers were they had a brief moment to kind of take control of the factory when it was failing, and they converted production. They had different. They tried to convert the production to different things, and the thing that they liked the most was they converted the production to a special type of kind of like I forget how do you say it. It's not quite a wheelchair, but some type of mobility device for children who had disabilities, and it allowed them more mobility to like play some type of sports, and like the workers loved it. And like I think supposedly like for the first time in their life they felt like they were doing something that mattered, and they liked seeing the smiles on the children, you know, being able to do stuff they couldn't do before. But the whole thing got shuttered. They couldn't like save the factory in time. They couldn't, you know, beyond just like converting production a little bit. So I'd be interested to see like where this goes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, one that, I mean, they are in an essential industry, and any country that wants to have some degree of autarky, you know, meaning they want to not be dependent on imports, is going to have to be able to create their own machinery, do their own metallurgy, have their own machine shops. And that's what these, you know, they're doing. You know, it sounds like they have transitioned a little bit into what they're making, just depending on, you know, what kind of materials they can get. But I think that one of the effects, I mean, that we've seen of sanctions is that while, and you know, and this is just from the economist perspective, while they do cause a ton of suffering in the countries that we put them on, they also serve to make those countries adapt. And as with Russia, you know, we've seen they got hit with massive sanctions and didn't do much to affect them because, you know, they were already used to it and had already built up their ability to, you know, carry on business despite U.S. sanctions. And the same is happening in countries like Venezuela. The sanctions have already been going on for a long time. Like, they're not new. This is, man, I can't even remember how long. I mean, we've been sanctioning Venezuela for a long freaking time, and Indorca is still around. Like, you know, this is not that old of an article. So, you know, the fact that they're still here kind of shows me like, yeah, they're going to make it. They've already have made it. It's, you know, and I'm sure they'll keep developing. And especially because Venezuela does seem like such a hot spot for real economic transformation, and working people, like people who are working in this factory, people who are working at, you know, in growing food for Seco Sasola, or working in their health centers or something like that. These people really thinking how to make the economy and do this stuff in a very like fundamentally different way. And so, you know, I think in Dorca, they're perfectly situated. Being in Venezuela, they have, you know, a ton of community support and solidarity. If anybody's going to figure something out, like, I think it'll be them. Like I said, they already have. So
Yeah, I remember I reached out to some Venezuelans, I think like 8 or 9 years ago, and I forgot. I think they conveyed to me that at that time that things seemed like they were at a breaking point, because the inflation was so nuts. They said that people couldn't even buy a gallon of milk, and I was very very concerned at that time. But hey, they've been pressing forward, and I'm trying to investigate the sanctions more, because I do want to reach out to Seco Sasola and see how they might be able to continue to assist Venezuelans here, because the reality is that like the trend in Chicago is that a lot of people who are hang on. Josh, can you mute your mic? There we go. A lot of folks who are basically like, the more manual labor you do, like the harder it is to find an employer here in Chicago, and a lot of folks of color have fall within that category and have, are making their own businesses. And I think I don't think that the labor market can really absorb these folks quickly within the city. They have to go to the suburbs. A lot of people are simply too poor to work in the suburbs because it requires a car. Public transit doesn't really get there, or it takes too long. So, some folks are already doing their own self-employment. Who some of the Venezuelans who've come over, and I think that that's going to be really the practical thing for a lot of them, especially as time goes on, and they want to have more respect and a viable future here. Or yeah, that's so. Yeah, but I gotta investigate these sanctions and see what's up, because um, I gotta see what to navigate. I know that I don't want to end up getting hit by OFAC again. That was the Office of Foreign Assets Control or something like that. That arm of the
Oh,
treasury
yeah.
that enforces the sanctions. Yeah, I got in trouble with them once when I sent some money. We did a fundraiser for Kobani in Rojava after after they defeated ISIS at that time, and they wanted to rebuild Kobani. I got we did a fundraiser in Chicago for them, and I was the person to send the money over to I think it was called uh, Reconstruct Kobani or something like that. Kobani Reconstruction, I forget. And yeah, I think PayPal right away, because the word Kurd was in it. They froze my account. They're like, "We're going to refer you to OFAC."
Yep.
So I guess, for people who want to show solidarity to Venezuela, I think should make sure that there's some understanding of what the sanctions are. That way you don't get bullied by OFAC. They told me they're going to watch me for the rest of my
Yeah.
life, even though they said that I didn't do anything illegal.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the great irony is like the Kurds, I think probably they're like after or right around that time, like became allies, like the US allied specifically with the Kurds. So, but yeah, there are Kurdish nationalist groups on terrorist watch lists or whatever. But yeah, shows to go. Yeah. Our, there you go. No good deed will go unpunished. Yeah, and it's the same thing, in Venezuela. It's also Cuba. My buddy in Missoula, he's been to Cuba several times just for music because he's a drummer, and yeah, he's from the last trip he came back. He's like, it's not pretty at all, and people are making dark jokes about starving to death. Because the sanctions have been. And despite the fact that every country in the UN will vote every year to end the sanctions on Cuba, we still refuse. So, but yeah, so we've got the sanctions on the one hand, trying to make life hard for people in Venezuela, and then the ones who immigrate here are ripe to be victimized by, unscrupulous employers. That is a long-standing practice. So yeah, we can help people organize cooperatively. Maybe some of that Venezuelan cooperativeness will rub off on us Americans. It might be useful.
Yeah, yeah, I'm hoping that. I'm hoping to also make more opportunities for folks to even have chances to go back. Those who aren't really here because they want to be here. I mean, a lot of folks, it seems like who I've talked to, it seems that a primary concern driving them is that they have a relative who can't get health care. And so they're trying to send money back to help them get some type of healthcare treatment. Um, that's evil. But something that comes to mind that might be interesting is there was this I don't know if you saw it. Maybe I'll bring it up. But there was this there's probably been cool ones since, but it was like a statement put out by the Alfredo Lopez Libertarian Workshop in Cuba shortly before the national rebellion that happened, where they were saying like, hey, and they basically anticipated a rebellion happening at any moment, an uprising happening at any moment, and they're like, we don't encourage that because the working classes here are so backwards. But here's what we do encourage. And so they were talking about the cooperatives in Cuba and saying like, hey, like I think they're basically kind of arguing like a lot of the cooperatives are the basis to work with, and they have to be improved. Uh, Fight against the degeneration that's happening, the corruption that's coming into them from abroad, but also their isolation, and also I think helping them to mature. That's a cool. Maybe we'll check it out on a future episode or something. But that I think was pretty cool to read.
Yeah, we've got some stuff on the website that Adjua wrote a couple of years back. I think probably 2016 or so. I want to say she, I think her and Jessica actually went down to Cuba with the Global Justice Center. They do a regular trip. I think they're doing them again now. So if you want to go down to Cuba and visit co-ops, you can go with the Global Justice Center. And yeah, they went down, talked to a bunch of co-op people, and it sounded like, they they had plenty of issues, right? It definitely wasn't all roses and sunshine. They, have had everything be state owned, and so they weren't coming from, our private industry capitalist mentality. They're trying to move from the everything is owned by the state to a more of an ownership mentality, kind of coming in the other direction and butting heads with the state apparatus, who often doesn't quite understand the co-ops necessarily that much better than people in the U.S. do, just from a different direction again. So yeah, they're facing issues, but I think there's a lot of hope there for sure. I think that if they're going to develop in a way that is true to what the Cuban Revolution was about and who the Cuban people are, it seems like co-ops are the way to go, or the only solution that's out there, because they definitely don't want to just ape the U.S. or become capitalists like everybody else. But they have to do something because the state-run socialist system has not worked very well. Although I got to say, if you're a conga player, man, Cuba is the place, because you'll get a state wage just to play Afro, folkloric music, play Afro-Cuban folkloric music. So it's got its benefits for sure. But when it comes to like food production, they haven't been able to keep up. And they're on an island, they have all that kind of issues as well. So, but
I found the link to that. That's a communique from the Alfredo Lopez Libertarian Workshop. It's pretty cool. What did they say?
I would imagine Havana libertarians are different than American libertarians.
Yeah, I don't give that term over to these new folks. Well, I wouldn't be surprised because the pro-capitalist people, at first I just saw them in the USA, but now they're in the Spanish-speaking world and other Spanish-speaking areas. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some of those there.
Let's see. Well, you got anything else to say about Venezuela, Endorca, sanctions?
Maybe that's good for now.
Okay. Well, we can move on to some other stuff. Some recent postings on GEO. I came across right here on YouTube the other day a series of interviews from this guy, Jeff Hunt, I believe his name is, as a little interview series called Storied San Francisco, Storied : San Francisco. And he got a couple interviews on there with worker owner from Other Avenues Food Cooperative, and then Arizmendi Bakeries, of course. And there was somebody else, some other cooperative, I can't remember at the moment. But very good interviews. So I contacted him, asked if we could make some transcripts of them. And he said, of course. And so posted that on the website. And it's definitely worth a listen/read, depending on your preferred format for getting information. Very interesting history that the Other Avenues Cooperative has. They started out in the late 60s and early 70s as part of something called the People's Food Conspiracy. And it was, which were basically food buying clubs. And at some point then in the 70s, I believe, they kind of transitioned out of that buying club model to an actual storefront and became a co-op. They experimented for like a decade with a multi-stakeholder model where they had both workers and consumer members, and consumers had some form of input. And then at some point that they decided that wasn't the way to go, and they converted to just a straight worker cooperative, which they are now. So it's a very interesting story and history to go through with Celia Lobuono Gonzalez. I don't know, Chris. How would you pronounce that name? Let me.
I haven't had a chance to review this thing that you're trying to share. You gotta.
Okay.
Can you paste
Present.
it?
Yeah, let me share my screen. All right, Chris. How do you say that name? You're on mute.
Lobuono, but I don't really see that type of name that often in Spanish. But it's a Lobuono. You're muted, Josh. I don't know if you're talking or not.
I was talking. So yeah. So anyway, here's the section of the article where she's talking about how in the 60s and 70s there were a series of neighborhood buying clubs that were called the Food Conspiracy, and their motto, which I think is a pretty good motto: if you can't walk to Food Conspiracy, it's time to start another food conspiracy. So just very kind of hyper local. And then in the early 70s, they a lot of the buying clubs apparently were having to shut down, and they moved to a brick and mortar and became Other Avenues. And they were also, part of a big network of co-ops, many of which still exist, some of which don't. Rainbow Grocery is another worker co-op grocery in San Francisco that is also still around. I think Veritable Vegetable might as well be. Yeah. So anyway, this was an interesting article for just how a co-op kind of, the evolution of a cooperative project, like starting out very small as just neighbors buying food together, growing into something a little bit more formal, and then expanding really kind of, or expanding and experimenting in different ways over the course of 30, 40 years, and not staying the same throughout it, really showing that, if you want your project to thrive and be successful, you need to be open to switching things up and trying new things. And they, did that. We managed to do that. And so I think it's a pretty interesting story. I don't know, Chris, you got any thoughts or comments? You said you hadn't looked at it, but
No, I'll be honest with you. I'm actually trying to make connections with Venezuelans over in Venezuela. It's a pressing thing, man. It's the whole thing.
Yeah.
So sorry, it's just been on my mind. One thing that's going on here in Chicago is so a lot of the folks are given like a 3-month subsidy for housing, and a lot of this, a lot of it's for like slumlords, and now like the 3 months are up, and a lot of them, they haven't even been given a work permit, so a lot of haven't been able to legally work, and so they can't continue being in their unit. And I don't know what the latest is. I saw an interesting message from a landlord to suggest maybe there's new subsidies coming in or something. So I got to follow that up. That happened yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, what does the city expect is going to happen when they have 27,000 people? They can't work legally, and they can't. I mean, obviously, what's going to happen? I mean, if they don't get another subsidy or get people work permits, people are going to be forced to work illegally if they're not already.
Mhm.
And hey, plenty of us have done that. Anybody who's ever worked for Cash on the Barrelhead, guess what? You've worked illegally. Oh, you go and do some work for a neighbor and just take money. Well, the IRS says that you owe them a chunk of that, and you're
Yeah.
both in trouble for not reporting it.
But the IRS has a specific language about that you're stealing from the government when you do that.
But I mean, obviously that's what's going to happen. And again, kind of bringing it back to like the connecting the dots with sanctions, immigration, labor issues in this country. It's like if you were somebody who wanted to have really cheap exploitable labor in Chicago, you might be very in favor of sanctions on Venezuela and resulting mass immigration, so you could have an easily exploitable population. So yeah, and God, the thing with the labor permits, I was, worker co-op people have in the past anyway done, I think, a pretty admirable job of figuring out structures to allow undocumented immigrants to actually work in the most legal way, well, in a way that actually is legal, through the LLC structure. I'm not sure though. There is a new government regulation, this like small business beneficial ownership act or something like that, that requires everybody to like report names and addresses of any owners of a company. And I'm worried that will affect some LLC worker co-ops who have undocumented members. I'm hoping it doesn't. I have not.
And so that legislation, was that just the government doing it on its own, or is it the result of certain lobbyists that kind of put that in the scope of the government and they started making?
It's more the result, I think, of large unscrupulous business entities and things like crypto scams and whatnot. But just like with all regulation, it's one size fits all, or it's supposed to be, even if it isn't. And so regulations, as always, get written for the big guys, and then the rest of us have to figure out how to deal with them. So yeah, I think that was the impetus. But nonetheless, I still think that worker co-op people are probably some of the best people for figuring out, okay, what do you do if you don't have a legal work permit and you still need to put food on the table and pay the rent.
Yeah, I think the best thing that the thing that's going to result in the best outcome from these folks is to like be imbued with stuff like Seco Sosola, go to that source for inspiration. And there's some leads that I got. I'm trying to work them through, trying to work with folks. And yeah, but another thing that's happening too is they've also began to preparing people to get evicted from the shelters. Like they've handed out those notices. I think they are like basically, yeah, they've already issued basic evictions saying like, hey, by this time you're out of here. But what's sad is that what's interesting though is that those shelters are an important form of um, breaking people down, because we've been talking to some of the folks who have been through these shelters, and I haven't heard one person say that these shelters are good. Any shelter, and there's all sorts of shelters. Not one person said the shelters are good, and like they're like horrified at the idea of going back to them. And so I was talking to some folks at length. Last folks that I was talking about at length, they're basically venting about like what the shelters were doing to them, and they said basically the shelters have trained them to not ask for anything, to just try to avoid talking to anybody, because they said that regardless of race, skin color, like nationality, gender, or position in the shelter. Like it could be someone who cleans up, it could be someone who has a clipboard, someone who sits in the desk working, someone who stands up working. They said like everybody treated them like absolute garbage. And anything that they would talk, like anything that they might do in an interaction with one of the shelter workers would be a cause for retaliation, writing them up, some type of punishment. And so they were like broken down. And so I think that kind of, to me, it seems like what's going on. I don't know if it's that intentional, but it seems like they're really trying to develop in Chicago. They're really trying to develop a very vulnerable population to pit against another section of the population. I think that it's working very effectively so far, and so my task is to undermine that.
So how do we do that? I mean, because that's the big issue, like, and that's like an elephant in the room, what you just said. I mean, I live, not 100 yards from a woman who used to be a member of HODAD's worker cooperative, the tree planting cooperative in the Northwest, Oregon and Washington in the 70s and 80s. And they ended up going out of business. And she said just straight up, the reason that we couldn't stay in business was because we all of a sudden were facing so much competition from immigrant labor that would work for so much cheaper than we would, that we just lost all our contracts. And that was that. And she just doesn't have bad feelings about, towards, people from south of the border or anything. It's not like that, but you could see why somebody would. And when you have, some place in like Chicago, like all of a sudden there's 27,000 people. And if you're a low wage worker and all of a sudden you're competing with a whole bunch of other folks. Yeah. I mean, so in the co-op spirit, then it's like, we gotta remember everybody, right? Like, and remember that we're all in this together. And it's not like, because if they want to do the divide and conquer, we have to do the unify thing, right?
Yeah, and it's going to be very hard in Chicago, because even within the co-op world, and maybe that's the Mondragon influence, and also just the legacy of the hierarchies in Chicago. Like it's not Chicago, in my opinion, is not an ideal place for this type of unity to happen. There's already been a very big, I think, a pretty strong atomization that's existed in Chicago, and it's got even. I think it's pretty. Yeah, it's maybe it's hard to tell if it's gotten any if the atomization is decreased or not. But I think it's gonna have to be persistence. But it's also like part of it though. It has to be there has to be white folks who actually want to see um, migrants and people of color not be beggars, because those are the people I stay away from. A lot of the white folks, all they want to do is kind of like provide services, like when it's convenient for them. But there are, and I'm part of the tendency that exists also among like a lot of these new Venezuelans are like, we don't want like we appreciate, these handouts, but we want some type of self-sufficiency, and a lot of people are not trying to give that to them. And I'm more interested in teaming up with the folk, and it's only folks of color who I've seen who have the sentiment, which is basically, yeah, we're giving these people fish, but we're not teaching them how to fish. We're not giving them any self-sufficiency, and it's only folks of color, very few of them, who are pissed off at this. But and one of the other challenges though that I'm trying to raise more and more among folks of color is that as long as folks of color are least able to even participate in helping out our own people, like these types of ideas are not really going to be hegemonic. They're not going to be that strong, because right now, like in a lot of the mutual aid or whatever, the volunteer stuff, it's mostly white folks who are available to help out and that needs to be questioned. And they come in with just the whole like, well, let's give them something um, that's gonna essentially keep them in a position to where the dynamic is they beg to me and I give to them. Um, so yeah, war on the beggardom, the dynamics of the beggardom, so that at least my peers don't have to beg anyone.
Yeah, this came up a similar topic in a webinar I was watching. And I sent you the link. We talked about a little bit with some Native American folks who are doing co-op development and kind of from an indigenous perspective or from their perspective. And one of the things that they talked about was really wanting to get away from this idea that, oh, poor people need to be you need to be miserable and suffering, right? And then we'll give you stuff to ease it, the suffering. And she's like, no, we don't do that. We start from an abundance perspective. Like you all, like all the people who are, in need, you all know how to do things. You all have skills. You all have abilities. Let's figure out what those are and what you can do. Not, see who can be the most miserable and begging for a handout. Like that's not the way to do it. And so, yeah, I really appreciated that perspective because, having like volunteered at some soup kitchens and stuff like that and done some kind of social service work. You definitely see that. And it's really disgusting because it dehumanizes people. MJ says, I do not care for how leftists are branding their traditional charity as mutual aid. Oh, yes. Say it again for the people in the back. That for real. It's definitely become a thing. When do you think it started? That because everything is now mutual aid, like every charity thing is mutual aid. Is it just since the pandemic? It feels like before that there was a little more understanding, like with like Occupy Sandy and stuff, when they were like that mutual aid was actually mutual and not unidirectional. I don't know. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, for sure. I saw it like overnight in 2020. I would only see anarchists talking about mutual aid up until like shortly after the shelter in place orders happened in Chicago. All of it, like overnight, even like people who identify as like American liberals or like American Democrats, affiliated with the Democratic Party, those folks were using the term mutual aid as well. But it wasn't, in my opinion, it wasn't really that different though. The way they do it's not that different from like how a lot of like anarchists or abolitionists do mutual aid, in my opinion. A lot of the mutual, even before that, I think it helped the same dynamics.
Yeah.
And thoroughly racist and anti-indigenous as well when you see things like a Food Not Bombs group not wanting to uh shaming people of color who want to like share meat.
Eat meat. Yeah.
um when like
Oh,
the local natives, that's their way of life, that's been their way of life for a
yeah.
long time. So but yeah, I mean, to me it just, what I think what happened was just that an already existing tendency of like superficial mutual aid, um, just maybe it didn't get replicated, but there was other people doing the same in an analogous way. Um, I wrote an article about it in 2021. I was like, what the heck? And I think a lot of Chicagoans were so like absorbed with a lot of like Chicago like anarchists were like really absorbed in their own mutual aid networks that they weren't able to see that outside of that little ecosystem, there's also these other ecosystems they're calling themselves mutual aid that were totally something else. There's a lot of them. But to me, just an expansion of existing problem. I will call it I call it proletarian charity. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, that is a good point. I mean, because it does seem like there's a fine line between some of the, what is mutual aid, what is charity, is Food Not Bombs charity, is it mutual aid? Different groups maybe fall into different categories. That's wild though, as Food Not Bombs trying to shame somebody because they're not vegan or whatever, especially if they're native. I mean, if it's anybody. I'm as somebody who was a vegetarian for a long time, um, I understand all that, all the reasons, but man, don't be a proselytizer. So MJ wants to know what article you wrote in 2021. Yeah, I want to see that too. We might need to post it.
yeah. It's terribly written, but it was just kind of like,
Yeah, clean it up a little.
someone had to say it. Someone had to say it.
Yeah, well, somebody needs to say this stuff.
So I put a link of it into the chat.
Yeah.
But yeah, one of the things, I don't know if I mentioned this in the chat, but man, one of the things that happened was in Chicago, and this is coming from the anarchists too, was their idea of like who would step in to like to organize people. It's all basically the laptop class. Like there was this thing going on with the anarchists, and I was like, whoa, like, because I'm not gonna point fingers. Because I think the people who basically facilitated this, they meant well, but there was something going on where they were identifying where who's gonna organize, who's gonna like be a central node to help like get things together to create like survival networks or safety networks, and the leaders were the laptop class people. And then what else was going on? I remember one time there was this like meeting for Southside folks in Chicago. It was a virtual meeting, and there's people who stepped up who wanted to help, and it was all white folks who had stepped up. And I remember announcing to everybody, I said, well, if there's going to be coordinator roles, like one thing that I really want to see from y'all is that you're taking time out to be working with other people, especially people from different classes or whatever, to teach them, if they don't already know, how to do some of this coordination stuff. That way it's not just you. And I may or may not have said explicitly, like, I want to see folks of color learning how to coordinate, not just taking orders from you. And that stuff, like, it's the looks on their faces. It was like, Like I was telling like a really good horror story, and you know,
Uh-huh.
like yeah.
Are you questioning my good intentions?
And
Oh.
I don't know if like if they like I don't mean to talk smack uh about them. I'm not trying to do it, but that's what I saw. And then what I also saw was that that never happened. They never took the time out
Mhm.
to try to like
Yeah.
partake in these
Yep.
skills. They never hit me up saying like, "Hey, I'm trying to do this, but I'm not making any success in trying to um, just be the white person who commands people of color." Um, and that's not to
Yeah.
say that like people of color we have our own organizing that we don't have our own organizing to do too, because we're also a lot of us are trained to just take orders, and you know my thing is to disrupt that and be like, nah, we we got to change these dynamics. We're not going to be bossing others, but we're going to be like co-coordinators and stuff, um, sharing the so that we're all giving orders and taking orders at the same time, you know, based on consensus. Um, so I'm not going to place all the blame on the white people too, because like folks of color, we need our own like insurgency of like changing our expectations of like what we should be doing. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and that same dynamic goes beyond um, even the racial parts of it in Chicago, because I'm very familiar with that exact same dynamic. Doing organizing in Missoula, Montana. Montana's 97% white. Like most all of the like groups that I've been in organizing, almost all of them were completely white. Um, and same kind of dynamics. It's strictly, it's on class lines obviously there. And you can just see it. It's so clear. People who, as you say, the laptop class, work at a nonprofit or work in an office, definitely, probably college educated, at least a bachelor's degree, drive a car that you don't hear it before you see it, kind of, that's like my cars, you hear them way before you see them. And they just kind of like the people who are like the upper class people have better jobs, they just kind of migrate, take the leadership positions in our volunteer organization. And the people who are janitors and fast food employees who just have a social conscience and want to do something, and they show up and they just end up getting told what to do by someone. you know it's exactly like their work environment. And yeah, no, I called it out, I tried to anyway, in a blog I wrote some years back about just, yeah, this dynamic and how we can just so easily reinforce and just recreate the same crappy dynamics from the regular society, if we don't make an effort to do it. And it's a real effort, as point out. I'm sure those, the laptop class white people who showed up and wanted to be the organizers, like their intentions are good, um, but they're not used to, they're just thinking about, oh, I'm doing a good thing. Probably, like, they're not thinking about what are like the unintended aspects of this. How is this reifying existing dynamics that we don't like? And so, I mean, I think it's incumbent on everybody. I mean, and good on you for bringing it up. I think it's like it's this kind of thing is going to have to be reiterated over and over and over again, and not just, again, I mean, because I live in Montana, so it's like I like, yeah, I understand. I've been around a little bit. I understand some racial dynamics, but it's like even in places where everybody looks exactly the same, you got to these dynamics are still there. Um, where can we find the article on your blog? Oh, I will pull it up. If you, let's see. Um,
yeah,
right.
you know, as I'm thinking about this
Yep.
more, this whole thing that happened in Chicago that I'm referring to, it was a multiracial failure. When I think about like all the people that were involved, it was it was yeah, definitely multiracial thing. There's that were recreating yeah, white supremacy. Techno, how do you say, like um the supremacy of a certain of different classes of certain work, um all these other things. But man, as I was writing this, I'm looking at this article that I shared. I had no idea at that time that in 1 or 2 years that I would see an article that said that 27,000 plus Chicagoans had already been like socially cleansed. At this time, like I noticed it like in my neighborhood, I noticed that people were leaving, they're gone, they're being replaced by others. Um, but I didn't sense that it was like part of a 27,000 plus social cleansing of the city, which I don't know. I mean, I think that's like a very critical um, ignorance that I'm going to be thinking about. Like, you don't, how do you quantify that? How do you detect that? How are you oblivious to that? How was I oblivious to that? Um, I guess that this is the limits of human and so-called intelligence. Like, I knew that a lot of people were getting cleansed out, but I didn't know how bad it was going to get.
Yeah, I mean, well, hindsight's 2020, but yes, and I am looking for the blog that I wrote on this. Not having any luck finding this that particular one. Can't remember where it was, but if I can find it, I will post it. I don't know. I remember I did get a couple of comments. We don't get many comments often on stuff that we post on Geo, but that one got some feedback from somebody who I felt like was in the position of being used to being at the top of the food chain and kind of were like, oh yeah. I mean, and my point was what I said in the blog was, if you have a mixed group of people, like mixed class group, and you have some people who are, from the white collar professions, and they're used to being paid, 60 to 100, 150,000 a year. And then you have some poor people who, we're used to making 15, 20, 30,000 a year maximum. And that's a good job. And, and used to being told what to do and being at the bottom of the hierarchy. And when it's like, okay, well, who's going to like be the bookkeeper? Who's going to do this or that? The people, who are the office people are going to go to those jobs. They're just, and not because they have some, they're trying to take control or anything. They have no negative intentions. And the people who are not used to taking control and who it's like, I've been pushing a broom. I've been, like doing like this kind of work forever. Nobody has ever put me in charge or told me, and I've always been told what to do. And so all of a sudden I'm in this group, even if it's offered to me, I might feel like, I don't know, like I just feel more comfortable, and so
Oh,
it
hey.
can be hard from both ends. Yeah.
So I don't know if I've mentioned this, but I don't know if I mentioned this in the past, but a lot of these, there's like at least 20 Venezuelans we're working with. We taught them basically to use Open Collective, and they've redistributed like 27 grand among themselves and their friends and stuff. At first it was a pain in the butt at first, because a lot of the folks and the sentiment was like, man, screw this technology, like screw this system, I don't want to deal with this. But like, hey, that's like the only thing that we like, that's the way it's structured, we have to like work with that. And but they got the hang of it, and some of these folks, they're kind of like new to even a phone, and we were able to do it, navigate all these like challenging situations. Like some folks, they they don't have a bank account, can't get a bank account in the USA, or credit union account even. And by the way, there's something interesting about one of the local credit unions when it comes to that maybe I should talk about at some point. But yeah, these folks, they learned how to do the Open Collective. They learned pretty much like what's reimbursable and not reimbursable. And hopefully they understand it's the nonprofit stuff. It's the nonprofit world of what's reimbursable and not. And what else? So that there's that question. Chris is in Chicago. Does he have any experience with or much insight into Mike Stroll's collaborative time bank? Yeah, I do. I'm part of the time bank technically. I love the idea of the time bank. What I would say is, if I were to, I think that the time bank doesn't have like a staff person or someone who's like kind of really trying to bring people in. And so I think that's one thing that it really needs. If like anybody's trying to do like time banking, I think you do need kind of like someone to really connect people, for two reasons. One is my own bias about how like our relationship shouldn't be too much based on the internet, but two is I think a lot of people also don't really get that involved with the internet to do something like that. So I suspect that you might need like a staff person to really like kind of bring people in to actually use the time bank. But it's cool. Anytime that I actually like go and look at the time bank and see what people are offering, it's so interesting. It's cool, and I just I don't get a chance to use it as much simply because there isn't that staff person. And my understanding is that it's something that could happen, but it's not going on at the moment. But yeah, I don't know if you have any other questions. I'd be interested.
Does the time bank do any like in-person get-togethers ever?
Possibly. I know that I've seen Maestro do like trainings to get more time banks off the ground.
I mean, because I think just like a couple times a year, quarterly or monthly, like potluck kind of thing, just like put it out like members of the time bank, let's all get together, have a meal, and make the connections in person rather than looking at the website. That might be the thing. My mother was part of a babysitting cooperative when my dad was in college, and I was like 3 to 5 years old, and they had essentially a time bank. They used poker chips to keep track of the hours that they were babysitting for each other, and they coordinated through a monthly meeting, quote unquote, where they get together at somebody's house and make margaritas and sit around and be like, okay, how many poker chips you got? Oh, you've got a whole bunch. That means you've been doing a lot of babysitting. You need to go, like, you're required to go on a date with your husband soon and use some of those poker chips. Like, you got to do something. And if somebody didn't have a very big stack, they got put at the top of the list to get called when anybody needed babysitting. And so I think they can definitely work. I think what made this, which they called a babysitting co-op, I just put a link in the chat here. They called it the babysitting co-op. It was very much a time bank. And what made it work was it was very specifically focused, and everybody knew each other. We're all families and university family housing. So I think the in-person things, I think that could really help. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think that I think one interesting thing with the time bank that I've seen is with the few people I've interacted with, like they don't want to deal with the whole like currency thing of it. They just like want to help others, and they're just like this strong sort of like voluntary communism thing, or like, how do you say, like, I think in Spain during the Spanish Revolution with 1936, 1939, I think one term they have for that was take from the pile communism, where like you're not keeping track of stuff. You just give, whoever needs it takes it. That's one thing I noticed with some of the interactions I've had in the time bank is I don't, including myself, like I don't want to keep track of the hours. I just like, if I can help, I want to help out. Like I'm happy, if I see someone that I want to help, I'll help out. I don't want to go back into the thing and log the hours. And I think people are in that mood that like Peter Kropotkin was in when he wrote I think it's in The Conquest of Bread, where he's like, do you really want a future where you're doing all these receipts? Like, do you want more receipts?
Yeah, I mean, I can see both sides of it, I guess. On the one hand, yeah, you like that, like, take from the pile communism, and it is kind of the classic, from each according to their means to each according to their needs kind of definition. And it can work probably sometimes, but and also that, is like an offers and needs market. Like, so maybe what you guys need more of are more offers and needs markets and less of the time bank, which I know that's another thing that Mike is also into and does trainings on, but maybe that's incorporating those two things might be good. But one of the, I mean, I don't know that so it seems like in practice, not everybody is an anarchist. In practice, not everybody is just going to take from the pile and only what they need and give what they can. And because we, if we want to organize ourselves in larger social groups, I think we kind of end up needing systems, even if we are anarchists. That's one thing that surprised me when I visited the Ghana Intentional community, spent a couple months there on Staten Island in New York City. A whole lot of people who were avowed anarchists, was having conversations about anarchism over dinner with several of the members. And one of the things that really surprised me in this, intentional community of about 70, 75 people, started by hippies in the early 80s, was how many checklists there were. Like, these are a whole bunch of hippies, and man, there is a checklist for every single thing. Like, if you get tasked to clean the bathrooms or to do the dishes, or there is a checklist for it, and you do the checklist. And if you ask a question about what you're supposed to be doing, the answer will be, look at the checklist. And the reason for it is because they figured out, if you're going to organize all these people, especially all these, like, a bunch of free-spirited, free-thinking people, you need to have some organization. You need to have, you just got to, and it makes everything work much smoother. And after a while, I figure out, like, oh yeah, the checklists are really, really useful, and the stuff like that. And even Michael, he, the core members of that commune, there were a dozen of them when I was there. Of the 75 members, there were 12 who were like a full income sharing group who live basically like a family. And any money that any of them make goes into a joint account. Any expenses that they have comes out of that joint account. If one of them wants to do like a big thing, like go take a vacation to Paris or something, that will be approved by the group and comes out of the account. And Michael, when I went, we went up to visit Jessica Gordon Imhard for a retreat up at her house. And so along the way, drove up with Michael, and he's buying stuff at the convenience store, or whatever. And everything he buys, he writes down, makes a note of, and it goes in like the little folder that, because they keep track of all the money. And that's just part of the deal. Like, if you're going to be part of this group, you have to do this so we can do the accounting and keep track of it. It's like, which to me, is somebody who has like never balanced my checkbook once in his life, like, seems ridiculous. But it's also like, okay, well, this is what makes if this is what it takes to have an income sharing group, then fine. I'm fine with a few more receipts. You get to have an
That'll be the name of a affinity group or a co-op incubator: checklist, or commune checklist.
The checklist and receipt commune.
But which I wanted to get into that next, so the whole offers and needs thing, because I think that I think that, like, if anybody, I was mentioning this to some other folks, that if anybody like wanted to do a time bank, but you don't really have like the people power to like run it, or people are not inclined to get onto the internet to participate, just do offers and needs. And I feel like the offers and needs is something that exists in the time bank in a way. Like, And I think offers and needs is just so cool, and it's bordering on fun if it's not fun. Um, I would just do that because you don't really need as much sort of like overhead or like volunteer labor power to pull that off. I think it's just amazing how much people can be helped with the offers and needs. Like I think
Yep.
if someone were to ask me like what's one of the activities that I like the most, I would say offers and needs. And I don't even do them enough. I think one of the coolest things that I've seen for offers and needs is one time I was like preaching it, and this one person, we're like in this meeting, there's one person who's like this a certain race of person, and they were talking about like, hey, you know what, when I want to try this offers and needs thing that has been mentioned, is he goes, I feel silly saying this, but I just want to give it a try. But he goes, I would like to like know if y'all know anyone who is the same race as me, who is sort of like a leader or respected person in their community. And he felt silly. He was like, this ain't gonna work. Y'all aren't gonna know anybody. And then we gave him like 10 people's names, like, and they never heard of them. And we ourselves, we didn't even realize that we know these folks. But he was just astonished that it worked. And he's been off building his own thing. And I think it was with the support of all those folks. And it was really cool because like one of the complaints that he has is that in racial discourse, his people are never mentioned. And it's like really emotional.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause it's only like in Chicago and probably much of the USA, a lot of times like the racial discourse is about Black folks and Indigenous folks, and outside of that, a lot of people don't mention other racial minorities. They're part of that, and that was really cool, man. That was one of my favorite offers and needs uh, interactions.
Yeah, no, that's great. Good story, and that's uh, again. I mean, yeah, I really like the offers and needs model because, like you say, it's less overhead than trying to actually run a time bank, and the offers and needs event itself is an event. You know, you're getting people together in meet space in reality. Where, I mean, that is so beneficial in building solidarity. One reason why I think maybe this year, definitely by next year, we will have another in-person GEO retreat. It has been several years, but like that, those just a couple of days or a couple of hours, even, in the same room with people can make such a big difference in making the connection. Whereas it's not quite the same if you're just looking at a spreadsheet on your computer. So, yeah. Well, with that, Chris, we're an hour and 15 in here. About time to wrap her up. You got anything you want to close on, or shall we just call it an evening?
I would not join a commune or a co-op or an affinity group that calls itself Spreadsheet, because there are those cooperators who love spreadsheets. That's it. It's like that.
There should be like a little like disclaimer, like on a co-op. Is this a spreadsheet co-op or not a spreadsheet co-op? Are you like, GEO, do you have spreadsheets and not use them? Because that's maybe a third category.
Rec of Madwork said that one time they were filling out, back to the checklist, they were filling out like a co-op form, some like co-op event, and it was like a long form, and one of the options was I like clicking or like select, I like checking checklists, and then they give them all these like options, I think all these boxes they could check.
Check.
So some people are just filling them out, just checking those boxes.
It's gratifying to check a box off. Yeah. All right. So tell us in the comments, are you for or against the spreadsheet co-op model? All the rage among the laptop class.
Or the answer to Kropotkin's question: do you want a future with more receipts?
Yeah, some people would be like, hell yeah, there's not nearly enough receipts. Dude, I know people like that. They're called bookkeepers, right? Like my mother is a bookkeeper. My dad's the same way, both of them, man. They want receipts for everything. I've got a friend who was dealing with her parents' estate, going through their records. Her father had worked at the Social Security Administration. They had receipts for like groceries going back to the early 90s. So some people, yeah, they're going to answer Kropotkin in the positive.
The receipt pathology.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, each to their own. Okay. On that, we'll say goodnight.